Hello everyone, this is Shadow. Due to copyright restrictions on YouTube, I can't publish many of the audiobooks you love. That's why I've created a special paid service where you can enjoy over 300 high-quality audiobooks from platforms like Webnovel, Pocket FM, Audible, Wuxia, and more. Each novel comes as a one-time purchase, no subscriptions, no hidden fees. After payment, you'll receive full access via Telegram, along with all future updates for that novel. You'll find a wide selection of your favorite genres and titles, always in premium audio quality. Check the full list of available novels in the description. DM me now to get your favorite stories in audiobook form and start listening today. Chapter 1043 Exhausted Orcs. Chapter 1043 Exhausted Orcs. Michael stood in front of a massive automobile factory. It was a few hundred meters from each side, bigger than even the factories found in the nation of Reborn. They spared no effort in creating this masterpiece. They allocated almost all of the magnetic shadow orcs these past few days, prioritizing this over the Reborn road. And their work had finally borne fruit. The automobile factory was finally done. Boss! Kong, the yellow manky chief engineer, approached him with a smile. All of our safety checks have gone positively well. We are able to start the production within a few hours. Michael smiled. Good. How many units can we produce in a day? They walked through the entire factory line, with Kong showing him the different processes involved in making an automobile. Of course, they followed the blueprints of factories back in the modern world where different parts were created at the same time and only assembled at the late stages. First was the press shop where metal was molded into the correct shapes. Then, onto the body shop where the parts are melded into each other to create an even bigger part. After that, they were passed off into the paint shop where the parts were coated with layers for durability. They stopped at the chassis assembly line, where the engines, transmission, suspension, wheels, and the interior would be assembled into one final piece. There were already some manky engineers doing their tests ahead of them. Good morning, boss. If all goes well, we'll be able to create 100 automobiles in a single day easily. Michael was very much satisfied with that number. If they could sell off those units, then they'd be able to rake in 10 million sand dollars in a single day. That was truly a frightening amount. Great work, guys. Where are the orcs? He wanted to see the MVPs of this whole project. Without those guys, they wouldn't have been able to create something so amazing in a short amount of time. They're taking a well-deserved break, boss. The manky engineers pointed him towards a very dark part of the assembly line, where the car seats were being made. It seemed that the orcs had made it their temporary shelter for the day. They deserved it. They didn't rest for a single moment during this entire project, after all. Despite how unnatural it was for them to do construction, they pushed through 24/7 in order to fulfill their missions. How was it? Did you guys have fun? He asked jokingly. The Sea of Shadows shivered. Boo-too-too. It was the hardest thing we've done. Rata, I hope we don't have to do that again. The shadow orcs looked absolutely spent. They looked even more haggard and injured than when they invaded 2 strongholds in a span of a few days. Thank you for your sacrifice, he said to them. He could tell that they absolutely hated working construction. It was truly unfortunate. They were the only ones who could have done this job. If there were any other alternative, he would have done so already. Listen guys, great work. As a reward, I'll be giving you all a good vacation back in the nation of Reborn. You'll be able to eat as much chocolate as you want. It's on me. Immediately, the shadows stood at attention. The mere mention of their favorite food had them fervently excited. Really, boss? He nodded. And you know what, we'll take it slow this time. We don't have to finish the Reborn road this fast. From now on, we'll have the real construction workers do the job. The shadows got even more excited. Finally, they were out of this responsibility. Boo-too-too. Praise be to Lord Michael. Ratata. Praise be. Yes, they'd be delaying the finished Reborn road system, but at what cost? He had a feeling that the orcs would literally become gaunt and sickly after continuing to do construction work for more than 2 weeks. For the health and betterment of his allies, he chose not to prioritize profits. He was never business-oriented. Reborn was nothing without its people. And anyway, with this automobile factory finished, they wouldn't have to worry about profits for a good long while. The upper echelons were now just realizing the full potential of the automobiles. Now that they were in possession of a vehicle that could travel hundreds of kilometers in under a day, they made full use of it. They began to start their preparations. What kind? Well, unlike the conglomerates who could afford to get their resources back from the Upper Queens region, the upper echelon could not do so freely. It was way too costly for them to transport their resources from that far away, even with the automobile in hand. So, their only choice was to source their resources locally. That meant they would have to contend with the local companies. However, There was only so much metal ores to be harvested or trees to cut down in the lower Queens region. Since the local companies were already set up well before the upper echelons arrived, they had the advantage in this resource fight. The mining companies already had their mines set up, farmers already had their soil toiled, and all of them had convoys up and running to transfer those resources to and from their territory all the way to New Sparta. But the upper echelons were called elite for a reason. Some of them chose the easy way by simply buying their way to cooperation. By paying out a good percentage of profits, they would be able to get resources from the local companies themselves. Some of them chose the hard way, finding treasures where no treasure could be found. Their unique and powerful magnetics were able to find massive ore veins that no local company had yet to find, allowing them to have their own resources. And some, well, they officially did nothing. The local companies simply had an unlucky turn of events as their crops died out due to some freak weather event. Chapter 1044 New Car Deal. Chapter 1044 New Car Deal. Some unlucky local companies found themselves in the red. Their farms experienced an unprecedented blight, destroying all of their crops in a single night. Their mineshafts collapsed with neither an earthquake nor explosion. And their carriage convoys suddenly disappeared without warning during their journey. With how competitive New Sparta was, this kind of setback was incredibly perilous. If they wanted to recover, then they'd have to go into debt. But even then, their progress would be incredibly delayed compared to their peers. And once they did get back to their feet, there was no guarantee they'd be able to succeed. And by then, they won't be able to get themselves out of debt, forcing them to be bankrupt. But miraculously, some upper echelons came in as their savior. They reached out their hand towards these unlucky local companies and offered them some help. They came with the promise of giving them a huge lump sum of money in exchange for their loyalty. And most of them took it. Not only were they offered life-changing money, but they were also given the chance to become a sub-company for an upper echelon. Some would say this would be the best thing to have happened to them. But of course, some knew the dangers of such an offer. They saw through the sinister smile of those upper echelons and chose to slap their hands away. They chose to fight. However, how could they fight against the elite? Not only were they stronger, richer, and more influential, but now they had automobiles in their possession. It enabled them to spread their advantages far out into the lower Queens region, suppressing the local companies like a plague. The only ones who were able to stave off the upper echelons were those from the Metropolis faction. They had automobiles longer than anyone, so they weren't as vulnerable to their expansion than others. So as it stood, it seemed that the upper echelons would soon make the lower Queens region into their own territory. They began swallowing or defeating local companies at a commensurate rate. That was until one specific day. That day, the Reborn company announced something in New Sparta. The creation of the Reborn Automobile New Sparta dealership. Now, anyone could purchase their own automobiles from the Reborn headquarters just outside of New Sparta's walls. When people entered the Reborn camp, they saw automobiles displayed in grand stages, with neat bows tied on top as if they were gifts on Christmas morning. Welcome to Reborn Automotive Dealership. How can I help you? A leader from a local company stumbled in his words. Would you like to purchase an automobile of your own? Asked the Rebornian Lamia. The man shook his head. No, I was just curious. We can't afford to buy an automobile just yet. Haha. The Lamia didn't jeer or make fun of him. Instead, she led him towards one of the tables. Please take a seat here and we can talk about our automobiles, she said. The man couldn't even say anything before she led him to a seat. Then, as soon as he took a seat, he was served a cold beverage and some bread snacks to eat. Here are some of our pamphlets. You can see here that we have two options for automobiles, a sedan and a four-wheel truck. Both of those have two options as well, one where the chassis is made out of special steel. The other, on the other hand, are made out of Damascus steel. The man's eyes glistened with yearning as he looked at the Damascus-lined truck. He wanted to buy this automobile. In fact, just seeing it displayed just a few meters away from him made his heart ache with heartbreak. But its price? 100,000 sand dollars. He could have bought a normal automobile, one that only cost using gold coins. But that was not viable in this very hectic time. He'd heard of some companies buying these normal automobiles and suddenly getting ambushed in the middle of nowhere by some bandits. Though he didn't know of any bandits who had multiple high-leveled magnetics under their employ. Anyway, if he wanted to compete in the harsh market of New Sparta, he needed an automobile that could actually compete. But unfortunately, it seemed that it was not for him. Sorry, I don't think I belong here, he said, leaving his seat. The Lamia stood up and bowed to him. All right, dear customer. If you have any interest in buying our automobiles in the future, then our dealership will be happy to help. The man started to walk out. Or if you want to buy an automobile today, then we can help you out as well. It doesn't matter if you can afford it right now. He stopped in his tracks. Really? The Lamia smiled. Yes, dear customer. The Reborn company is well aware of the fact that not everyone can afford their own automobile. That is why we have come up with a new payment plan. Here are the details of our automobile loan. She handed him another pamphlet containing the general details of the loan, as well as an easy-to-understand table grid. The man studied it for a few minutes in total silence. You're saying that I only have to pay 1,000 sand dollars today, and I can take home my own automobile? The Rebornian attendant nodded. That is correct. You only need a down payment of 5,000 sand dollars and a monthly installment of 2,000 sand dollars for 4 years in total to buy an automobile. The man's eyes widened. That was such a good deal. If he only had to pay 5,000 sand dollars today, then he'd be able to use the rest of his money to invest back into his company. Plus, he'd have his own automobile to hasten their progress like the upper echelons. Sign me up, he immediately shouted. The Rebornian Lamia smiled and nodded. All right, please look over the details one more time before we finalize the contract. Chapter 10:4500 Daily. Chapter 10:4500 Daily. On the first day of production for the new Reborn automobile factory, they produced 100 units and sold 100 units. The news about the car installments spread like wildfire. Every single company in New Sparta tried to buy an automobile from the new dealership. This was their only chance to finally even the odds against the upper echelons. The first 100 spots were quickly filled up early in the morning. Some tried to buy multiple automobiles, but Michael rejected them. His goal for this kind of deal promo was to let the automobile become as spread to as many people as possible. It wouldn't be good if only a few companies were in possession of them. In fact, once the conglomerates and the upper echelons found out about this, they quickly lined up to buy one as well. He turned them down, of course. And even when they tried to be sneaky about it and used some spies to buy the automobiles for them, he was still able to suss them out and throw them out of the line. At the end of the day, all the lucky customers waited at the Reborn headquarters for their automobile delivery. And even those that were unable to join the deal gathered outside the walls of New Sparta to take a gander at the event. Some were curious. Were the Reborn company actually going to go through with this deal? They only paid 5,000 sand dollars as a down payment. And now, they were being promised a Damascus-lined automobile. Just then, the Lamia attendant walked out of their headquarters and addressed the crowd. Thank you for your patience. The automobiles have finally arrived. And just as the crowd was about to say something, they suddenly heard the majestic sounds of heavenly horns booming from behind them. Everyone turned around, only to see an armada of automobiles parked outside New Sparta. Except, there was a large velvet draped over the entire car itself, with a bow on top to tie it all off. Reborn was ready to give them their gifts. The lucky customers were guided to their automobiles, and they were given the privilege to unbox their new purchase. They were moved to tears. I can't believe the Reborn company is actually doing this. Do they not care about profit? I don't care. I'm very grateful for them. Damn, I found out about this way too late. But thankfully, it seemed that the Lamia attendant had something to announce to the crowd gathered at the Reborn headquarters. Everyone, the Reborn company thanks you for your patience. Unfortunately, all the slots has been filled for today. But come back early tomorrow as well. The first 100 people will be able to avail the installment promotion once again. Wah! People were surprised to learn that this automobile deal didn't last just one day. It was a continuous thing that would go on almost indefinitely. That didn't make sense at all. Not even the conglomerates nor the upper echelons could understand how or why the Reborn company was doing this. They're selling the cars again? Gabriel's father slumped over his desk as he looked at the reports. He massaged his head. The Reborn company was giving him a lot of headaches. Why? He asked himself. From a business standpoint, this new move of theirs was simply a bad decision. By allowing people to purchase automobiles using an installment, they would be devaluing their own product. They could have limited the amount of automobiles they sold. If they did, its price would continue going up. They'd be able to raise it up as high as they wanted, and there would still be people willing to buy it simply because of its tremendous use. The conglomerates certainly would have. But instead, they seemed to be going the route of ubiquity. They were spreading their automobiles as fast as possible. It didn't make sense. If the automobile was something simple to produce, then it would make sense. But as they learned after their extensive study of the construct, they found out that it was one of the most complex uses of mechanical principles known to man. He even heard that when the Hephaestus company tried to copy the automobile one-to-one, it took multiple master craftsmen working day and night for 3 days straight before they could complete it. But the Reborn company was selling them like it was as easy as making a horseshoe. And now, they're promising to sell 100 automobiles every day? That's absurd. It didn't seem possible. Were they bluffing? Unlikely. They'd be destroying their own reputation if so. Just then, a figure blurred beside him. It was one of his spies and informants. We found out where the automobiles come from, sir. They're not from the King's region. They were recently made. Gabriel's father turned to him, shocked. One of the possibilities he thought of was that the Reborn company had thousands of stock automobiles before they announced its public sale to the whole world. That would give them the illusion that they could produce automobiles at a tremendously fast pace, earning them a good reputation from their customer base. But his informant's words completely disproved that. It's their newly constructed building, sir. We saw the newly delivered automobile come out of that very structure. There is an extremely high chance that they produced those units inside. Gabriel's father blinked multiple times. But even that couldn't help him understand how that was possible. How about the King's region? Have we established our information network there yet? We need to find out how they're doing this. The man next to him shook his head. Not yet, sir. Our spies have experienced a little bit of a setback recently. We've been clashing with the other conglomerates and upper echelons trying to find the same thing. Gabriel's father sighed. That was just how competitive things were between them all. If there was anything scrumptious about the Reborn company, they wanted to be the first to know about it. Send some spies into their automobile building. I want to see their production. Chapter 1046 into Angora. Chapter 1046 into Angora. Meanwhile, back in Angora City, the territory had become a full-on Rebornian territory. The roads were paved with concrete, allowing hundreds of steel-plated automobiles running to and fro. They were stopped only by the flashing lights on the corner of the streets, cycling between green, orange, and red. Everything was modernized. Electricity became the norm. Processes were streamlined. And most of all, the entire scenery had become cleaner than it was before. Gone were the days where horse excrements littered the roads, or when people simply dumped their wastes out on the street. A group of people wearing inconspicuous clothes stood at awe at what they were seeing. They designed their clothes to look normal, at least for medieval times. But now, amongst modern linen and silk clothes, their attire looked ancient. What is going on here? One of the men asked. Is this really the backwood part of the royal continent? What are we supposed to do now? We're supposed to gather intel secretly, but we're standing here looking like we're jesters. Their anachronistic clothes drew them a lot of attention, causing one of the passerbys to come and approach them. You look like tourists, the homely woman said. Daya need any help? The leader of this secret expedition walked forward. Yes, we would like to know about your leader. Oh, our great savior Michael? What do you want to know about him? The woman enthusiastically asked. Anything. His background. How he built everything. The woman's eyes lit up. It looked like she was just waiting for someone to ask that question for a long time. Oh, I know about him. He's actually someone that's born from poverty and rose up to heights previously unknown. The woman began to tell them a story about Michael, which completely contradicted the original backstory they'd heard a day before. In fact, anyone they talked to told a completely different thing about Michael. But the strange thing was that they weren't lying. At least they didn't think so. They just really believed their own words. It seemed that the mythos around the enigmatic yet charismatic leader of Reborn had gone way out of hand, that no one knew exactly the truth. And the worst part was that they couldn't find any dirt on him. They wanted to see a crack in their kingdom, a skeleton in their closet. To no avail. They wanted to see how they were cranking out all of these inventions one by one. At first, they thought they were cheating. They thought they were using some kind of secret magic as an illusion to create this many automobiles in such a short amount of time. But there were none. It seemed that everything was being produced through these factories back in the nation of Reborn. There was an entire nation behind that company? I don't get it. Why does every single one of them only talk about Reborn? Some of these guys don't even know about the conglomerates. The upper echelons are probably even less known. That's insane. And everyone talks about someday hoping to migrate to the parched lands. Are they insane? That's a desolate desert. Their leader then gathered everyone together. Okay. Let's spend a few more days just gathering intel here in Angora City. And remember, do not indulge in any of this. They were from an upper echelon company who specialized in vehicle transport, which meant they were the ones most affected by the automobiles. They'd effectively lose one of their biggest shares in the market because of the Reborn company. This is stupid. Why would I? What's so good about being a Rebornian? Just because the streets were cleaner, the city brighter, and the citizens happier, didn't mean that it was better than their company. And they were going to make sure of that. So, they spent the first day just getting information. But that wasn't enough, so they stayed for another day. And of course, they stayed at a Rebornian hotel because where else would they sleep? And it would be stupid if they didn't at least familiarize themselves with their inventions. Then they stayed for a third day, and the fourth, the fifth, and by the end of it all, they didn't want to leave anymore. They'd gotten so used to living a life of comfort in Angora City that they simply found themselves unable to do their jobs, which was to find dirt on the Reborn company. They were the enemy. And yet, why did the enemy create something that would make them feel so safe and good? They weren't the only spies who ended up this way. Many more from the conglomerates and the upper echelons found themselves enjoying the life of a Rebornian. It was just so darned comfortable. But of course, not everyone was this receptive to Rebornian life. Some were bitter and some were plain envious. A masked group of men and women perched atop a cliff overlooking a city down below. Their eyes were directed at a certain building amidst the grass plains. This was one of the Rebornian electricity generators, the very nexus where all the electric lines were connected all over the Rebornian territories. They all looked at each other, before nodding. Then they disappeared into a blur. Deep into the night and their faces obscured, they certainly weren't here for a friendly visit. A magic spell permeated the building, creating a deafening silence. Then, the doors were blown wide open as the masked individuals rushed inside. But just when they thought they had free rein to loot everything in sight, they were suddenly alerted to a presence inside the building. 10 figures flashed and immediately slashed their weapons at the invaders. "Humans?" shouted the masked leader. There weren't supposed to be any guards here based on their intel. Certainly not magnetic humans. You're not from the Reborn company." A figure walked forward, showing himself to the invaders. "That's right, but we're from the same faction. And I can't have you sabotaging them," Alaric muttered. Chapter 1047 Same Faction. Chapter 1047 Same Faction. Somehow, Alaric Goldstone, the very leader of the famous legacies, was here in the Lower Queens region protecting Rebornian property. Thanks to his intervention, the would-be invaders of the electric generators were immediately killed before they could do anything. Alaric stared at the dead bodies in front of him before reaching down and removing their mask and their capes. But just as he suspected, there were no discernible emblems on their attire. Nothing that would tie them back to their real company. As far as they were concerned, this was just a random robbery. Did they really think they could hide from us? Their attire alone made them stand out, he said to one of his allies next to him. They laughed. From the very moment they arrived in the Lower Queens region, Alaric and his company had been tracking their every movement. They made sure that no one would do anything to sabotage the Reborn company, just like they planned. They had been expecting this for a long time. It was part of their strategy as the Metropolis faction. Having the Reborn company as a true dark horse was the best advantage that they were going to get. How did they know that? It was because they experienced it themselves. They were also blindsided about how powerful Michael and the Reborn company was, and that caused them to lose the auction. In fact, it was Alaric who proposed this to everyone. He lost to Michael, after all. So, they did everything in order to keep the true capabilities of the Reborn company a secret. That's what started this. Anyway. But when the Reborn company started their renovations in Metropolis, Alaric and the other people in their faction realized just how amazing their inventions were. The citizens of Metropolis experienced a great increase in their quality of life. And counterintuitively, even though most of everything in Metropolis was now plastered with the Reborn symbol, Alaric and the others found their companies actually prospering as well. They thought they'd lose a lot of business because of Reborn. But as it turned out, they were wrong. It only increased the wealth of the citizens, giving them more purchasing power which would then be used to buy from every company in Metropolis. It was a self-sustaining cycle. So now, Alaric and the other legacies weren't just protecting the Reborn company because they wanted to keep it a secret. They wanted to do it because they now believed in Michael's philosophy. Comfort above all. "Sir Alaric, Bobby has reported to me that an entirely different group attacked a factory in another town. They stopped it in time," said one of Alaric's allies. It was a cooperative mission. This was the reason why they couldn't show up in the archery tournament. They were too busy keeping the nation of Reborn safe and sound. Being a distant relative of the conglomerates, they knew just how brutal and ruthless business could be. And as much as they believed in the future success of Reborn, they were simply just too young to go up against the big sharks. They still needed time to grow. And hopefully, Alaric bought enough time for Michael and his company. "Show them what you showed me," he muttered. The second day of the automobile dealership had gone incredibly great. Too well, actually. Since there were only 100 people who could purchase automobiles, the lines were crazy. People queued up yesterday. Like, when the Lamia attendant told them about the whole deal. They literally camped through the cold night trying to keep their spots. Of course, there were some people who tried to sneak in, but they were quickly chastised out of the queue. Some even tried to buy a spot, but it seemed that the automobile was far more important than any money they were offered. And just like that, another 100 automobiles were sold in installments. Michael and Castell were both happy with this arrangement. And thanks to Una, they were assured that the contract would be held no matter what. If they reneged on the deal, well, they had the Montgomerys to answer to. The third day quickly came up, and just like before, the people queued up even before the night was over. There were so many people in line that it was starting to cause problems in New Sparta. All day, every day, there was just a permanent crowd waiting around the Rebornian headquarters outside the New Sparta walls. Michael was starting to worry about it. And even though they just finished construction on the factory, he already wanted to build another one. 100 automobiles in a day just wasn't enough. I'll wait until the orc's vacation is over. For now though, he had to make do. And just at that moment he felt a tremble on the ground. He immediately whipped his head towards a certain direction, feeling a disturbance in the mana. What was that? He had a bad feeling about this. The foreboding sense in his heart only grew as he heard panicked steps enter his ears. Castell burst into the room. Young master! The factory! He had a bad feeling about this. He immediately descended into his shadows and teleported to the automobile factory just a few kilometers away from New Sparta. And he couldn't. His shadow couldn't find a good spot. There was no darkness around. He had to teleport just a few hundred meters away from the automobile factory. Then he saw it. The whole factory ablaze in a red fire. The whole roof was blown open. Concrete rubble littered the ground around. He could see the remnants of the factory lines broken in half, its metal edges melting from the fire. Everything was destroyed. Even the half-made automobiles inside. Wait, the orcs! He scanned the area, finding 5 weak light mana signals around the perimeter. He teleported there. 5 orcs laid on the ground, breathing heavily from the burns on their body. They were heavily injured, but they were alive. Behind him, shadows appeared. Naruto, Sasuke, and the rest of the shadow orcs came to witness this moment. Their shadows seethed, bubbling. He'd never seen them this angry. He hadn't been this angry. Chapter 1048 Swift Retaliation. Chapter 1048 Swift Retaliation. Building the automobile factory this close to New Sparta, Michael expected some difficulties. He wasn't naive. He knew that his automobiles would end up clashing with some people's business, causing them to retaliate. But he didn't think they'd go this far. It was well known that all disputes against companies could only be settled through a good old-fashioned sanctum duel. One that was fair and honorable to both parties. Instead of that, they opted to blow up the automobile factory. Oh my God! Yuna arrived right next to Michael, watching as the orcs extinguished the fire from the factory. But it was too late. The explosion destroyed everything except for the foundation. This is unacceptable, she said. Grandmother will not stand for this. This was the exact reason why Zir Montgomery established the sanctum duel as global norms. It was to prevent humans from turning into savage beasts. A single misgiving like this could easily escalate to vendettas that last hundreds of years and a sea of spilled blood. In order to prevent an all-out war, the Montgomerys made sure to enforce a strict sanctum policy. When companies have disputes, they could not deal with each other without using a sanctum duel. The result of that duel must be upheld. Or else, they'd have to suffer the consequences of a blackout. What they meant by that was that they would no longer be protected by the rule of Montgomerys. And without their support, anyone could break their contracts without consequences. For example, the automobile installments. Because the contract was overseen by Yuna, the responsibility to ensure that contract fell on the Montgomerys. If someone broke those contracts, the Montgomerys would seek justice. But if for some reason Reborn broke a cardinal rule of the Montgomerys and incurred a blackout, then those contracts would be voided, meaning those who bought automobiles would no longer have to pay their monthly dues. And in the entirety of a company's lifespan, anyone would have made thousands of those contracts. So, if one wanted to live in a world dominated by Montgomery rules, one should not ever break it. Who would do such a stupid thing? Yuna bellowed. Meanwhile, Michael stayed silent before nodding to himself. There was only one reason why they would act this boldly. They don't need the Montgomerys, he muttered. Yuna gasped. The ersatz. It had been proven that the ersatz could somehow emulate the same power as a Montgomery, creating their own justice system. The artifice allowed them to do something this bold. This meant that whoever did this must be connected to ersatz. I'll contact my grandma, Yuna said. We'll find who did this. Miss Yuna, Naruto grumbled. Boo Tutu. Please let us handle this. Rada, Lord Michael. Do we have permission to act? Michael looked at the 2 orc chieftains and the sea of seething shadows behind them. They hated working construction. They detested working under the bright and intense light of the sun. They wanted nothing more than to be rid of this responsibility. But that didn't mean they weren't proud of what they'd done. They poured their blood, sweat, and tears for its construction. And its destruction meant that all of that hard work, all that sacrifices were all for naught. They were never meant to be construction workers. They were creatures of the dark. And thanks to this incident, they'd get the chance to show the world who they were. Do it, he said. And with those 2 words, the shadow orcs disappeared into their own shadows. All of them, both magnetics and mortals alike. It was going to be an attack even bigger than their invasion in the stronghold. Once they were alone, Michael turned to Yuna. Yuna! She hugged him, putting his head on her shoulders. You don't need to ask. I'll help you. Even without saying anything, she already knew what he wanted to do. You want to deal with them in your own way, right? He nodded. He didn't want to fight them. The shadow orcs would already do that on their own. No, he wanted to deal with them in their own element. After all, why did they destroy the automobile factory? It was because they were afraid of its potential. They were afraid of the massive change that it was going to create in the world. And with this change, they'd lose their power, their influence, and their wealth. Michael was going to take a page out of Castell's playbook. They're afraid of the future? Then he'll make that come true. He'll be the harbinger of the future. It didn't take long before the Shadow Orcs returned with a name. The TriStar Beastly Emporium. An upper echelon company ranked 41. They were a company who got their revenue from supplying magical beasts to other companies. They bred, raised, and delivered the fastest steeds among the upper echelons. At least that was before the automobiles arrived. Reborn disrupted their business greatly. They had invested a lot of money in their magical beasts, but all of that was going to be wasted just because of a single company who wasn't even ranked into the top 200. They couldn't let that happen. And it seemed that their resentment for Reborn caught the eye of a certain organization. One that offered them a good deal. Receive money, artifice, and power in exchange for destroying the automobile factory. It was win-win for them, so they quickly accepted the job. And what did they use to explode the factory? None other than the artifice themselves. The Shadow Orcs gathered all of this in just under a few minutes after they disappeared. They even knew the exact layout and location of TriStar's headquarters. Their shadows were already permeated throughout their members. And as it turned out, these sick bastards were using performance-enhancing drugs to their magical beasts, much to the detriment of their health. They even had a slaughterhouse to dispose of useless and decrepit steeds that would no longer serve their purpose. An hour after the explosion of the automobile factory, the TriStar slaughterhouse experienced a similar destructive eruption. The Shadow Orcs then went to each individual small cell where the magical beasts were stored, and freed them from their chains. They brought them the peace they deserved. The TriStar employees scampered to reign in the freed steeds. But their whips no longer had the frightening effect they were used to. Instead, it only made these unfettered beasts angrier. Suffice it to say, they got their revenge. The TriStar Magnetics tried to use their reality-altering powers to control the situation. But unfortunately for them, shadows appeared behind them with knives already aimed at their throats. They died, not even knowing what happened. One must take this into account. These were upper echelon members. They were the elite of the elite. Yet they fell within just a few short minutes of the attack. The preparations they'd worked so hard to build was destroyed in a single day. A few hours before all of this went down, Gabriel's father was alerted to something. Master Vanderbilt, we've just received word that the automobile factory has been destroyed. He'd instructed his spies to monitor the factory, learn its ways. And because of that, he unexpectedly caught on to the explosion the very moment it happened. He leaned his hands on the table. This is exactly what he'd feared. He knew it was only a matter of time until someone had enough of the changes in society. This is a tough lesson for them, he muttered, but one that would hopefully open their eyes to the truth. He then waved his hand, and a figure flashed beside him. Escort me to the Rebornian headquarters. I'll finally speak with the leader of Reborn and offer him our services. Tell our spies to start finding out who attacked them and why. I'll need at least that to convince them they need our help. Gabriel's father walked into a well-lit room and a menagerie of strange metal artifacts he couldn't understand. But he ignored those. Instead, he focused on the people in front of him. Standing on the left side, he saw the demi-human magnetic, Shiina, as she's called. Beside her was another famous name, Una Montgomery, the darling granddaughter of the famous seer. Then right next to her was a human woman who wore a maid costume, which he knew to be Castell, the CEO of the Reborn company. And then, there was the person in front of them sitting on the couch opposite him. A boy, with golden locks of hair and a gaze that was unlike anything he'd ever seen. There was a fierceness there that could not be hidden by his gentle demeanor. My name is Joseph Vanderbilt, the current master of our conglomerate's Lower Queens Region Division. And you are Michael, he presumed. No matter how absurd it seemed, there could be only one person who should sit at that position. Michael nodded. I am. Chapter 1049, he's Michael. Chapter 1049, he's Michael. After this confirmation, Joseph still couldn't believe that his guess was correct. This was Michael? This was the genius that created the Reborn company, the one that created the automobile, the concrete, and among other items that completely revolutionized the market. It was done by a boy in his teens? He was half expecting for it to be a joke, a practical prank in order to unnerve him in their first meeting. But as the seconds passed, reality got clearer. This was the truth. Is there a reason for this visit? Or are you simply here to look at me, Sir Joseph? The man shook his head as he tried to get rid of the shock on his face. It didn't work. I'm sure that you'll forgive my taking a moment. I'm simply shocked that you are as young as you are. Michael shrugged. And now that you've had your moment, can we get on our topic? Is there a reason for this visit? I only agreed to this meeting because you so openly announced your visit to the public. I am quite busy. This wasn't the first time that Joseph tried to connect with the Reborn company. All of them were done through a messenger, but this time Joseph actually walked into their headquarters himself. So Michael decided to finally humor him. Joseph was at a loss for words. Why did it seem like he was the one in the lower position? He was a master of a conglomerate arm. Anyone that he talked to should be appreciative of his visit. The problem was that this all seemed so natural. Even he couldn't help but feel that he was dealing with someone who was equal to him. And from what he could see, Michael thought that too. All right, I'll tell you. Join the Vanderbilt conglomerate, he said. This is the only solution to your current predicament. Michael and the rest of his allies behind him stayed silent. He was still leaning back on his couch, seemingly still disinterested in the conversation. Joseph subconsciously leaned forward, wanting to catch Michael's attention. At this moment, no one could truly tell which of them was part of a global conglomerate. I know that your factory was destroyed. Even if my spies didn't tell me, I knew that it was only a matter of time before it happened. Simply put, your Reborn company is still too green. It is not ready to contend with the likes of the upper echelon and the conglomerates. You'll get crushed. I think that it is truly unfortunate that New Sparta happened. Your company is still at its nascent growth. But because you are fighting with powers far greater than what you can handle, your growth will be cut short before you could fully explore your potential. And now, you have to learn a very expensive lesson. Michael still sat on the couch, arms crossed on his chest. And now you want us to join the Vanderbilt conglomerate? Is that correct? Joseph nodded. Only by putting yourself in the shade of the Vanderbilt name can you survive this fight. And before Michael could say anything else, he said, I know you want to say no, and I urge you to reconsider. Considering your youth, I know that you wish to exact your revenge against the perpetrator. But it's that hot-bloodedness of adolescence that will lead you to your company's untimely demise. I know that you're probably trying to search for the true identity of this upper echelon company. But you won't. And even if you did know who it was, it is extremely unwise to try and fight them. Then, he turned to Yuna and directly addressed her. Miss Yuna, I know that your grandmother taught you the capabilities of the upper echelons and the conglomerates. She did, she replied. Then you know, even if you retaliate on their company arm here in New Sparta, you'll only be shaking their nest. And soon enough, their stingers will be coming to sting. And it won't end there. Miss Yuna, I'm also sure that your grandmother also taught you about the consequences of breaking the rules. Usually, the other companies would be swarming to prosecute the breaker of rules. But in this case, the upper echelons will do nothing. They will not act even though someone broke the rules to destroy your factory. Why? Because it will benefit them. I'm sure they'll try to deny it, but they are wary of your company. They know just how revolutionary the automobile will be in the future. It will change the world. And in turn, it will cause your company to control the world. They don't want that. They'd rather destroy the progress of the world than to let a new company pass them by and become a conglomerate. So if you're waiting for justice, you won't find it. The upper echelons were incentivized to stay their hand. Once the Reborn company inevitably falls due to the continued attacks of this unknown assailant, then they would have the chance to swoop in and have everything for the taking. But if you join the Vanderbilt conglomerate, that justice will be swift and deadly. The other conglomerates or upper echelon will offer you their hands. But they won't have your best interest at heart. They simply want your inventions, and they'd give you sweet words in order to do so. Michael chuckled. Like what you're doing right now? And before Joseph could even say another word, Michael continued. Your words are duly noted, Sir Joseph. But you have one thing wrong. We're not just going to retaliate. We're going to win the war. We'll wipe the TriStar company off of the face of the earth. Joseph jolted. TriStar? And I'm sure that you'll find that out soon enough. Just in that same moment, a figure flashed right beside Joseph. It was one of his personal guards. The well-armored man leaned in to Joseph and gave him the breaking news. And as he heard more and more, his eyes widened to pure shock and surprise. Chapter 1050 Beast Farm Destroyed. Chapter 1050 Beast Farm Destroyed. Is that true? Joseph couldn't help but shout. The soldier right next to him nodded, before awkwardly peeking at Michael and the others. He wasn't used to their master having such a public outburst like this. He was usually such a composed person. Joseph just heard that one of the major TriStar farms had just been destroyed, with all of their animals freed and unshackled from their chains. Then, Joseph turned his head towards Michael, and a sense of premonition came over him. Such a coincidence. It couldn't be, right? TriStar, were they the ones that attacked Reborn? The soldier's eyebrows raised. Yes, sir. We just found that out through an investigation on their destroyed farm. He then began to tell Joseph about what they discovered. According to him, it was utter chaos in the Upper Queens region. That was right. This major farm wasn't located in New Sparta or anywhere near the Lower Queens region. This farm was located in the upper part of the royal continent, one that was reserved for the upper echelons. This was a main farm of the TriStar Company. This wasn't just one of their small branches meant to expand their business. This was one of their foundations. It didn't make sense. Joseph massaged his forehead as he struggled to understand what was happening. First of all, TriStar. Somehow, Michael and the Reborn Company found out about their assailant's true identity even before they did. And not just by a small margin either. They knew it well before their well-trained Vanderbilt spies had a whiff of information. They only found out about TriStar's involvement in the factory destruction after their farms were destroyed in turn. This meant that if the Reborn Company were the ones responsible for this retaliation, then they knew about TriStar before anyone else. Possibly within moments after they acted. This was absolutely shocking. It seemed that Joseph and everyone else were still underestimating the Reborn Company. The fact that their information network worked even faster than a conglomerate's meant that at the very least, they were magnetics amongst them. And then there was the matter of the TriStar farm. It was invaded, destroyed, and ransacked on the same day that they destroyed the automobile factory. It can't be a coincidence, he said out loud. Was this your doing? Michael shrugged. Maybe. Maybe not. The fact that Michael didn't even ask for any clarification meant that he already knew what they were talking about. Joseph was certain. They were the ones responsible for this. Now, in normal circumstances, he wouldn't have ever thought that this was possible. After all, he knew that although the TriStar beastly emporiums were only in the 41st rank within the upper echelons, they were still quite powerful in their own right. Their main beast farm, one that housed their most prized steeds and where they invested the most amount of their money, would surely have some strong defenses in store. At the very least, he was sure that they had a nascent spirit realm cultivator there to protect their main farm. And yet, it was still destroyed. It didn't make sense. Joseph turned to the guard right next to him. What did you find out about the destruction? The guard leaned in. Not much, sir. The assailants of the farm didn't leave much of their tracks. In fact, it took us a lot of time before we were even sure that this was not an accidental case of spontaneous explosion. Did you find any signs of a nascent spirit? He nodded. Yes, sir. We distinctly saw the signature of a first-stage nascent spirit cultivator in the scene of the destruction. They were dead. And the strangest part was that we couldn't sense any other nascent spirit cultivator. Whoever attacked them, they didn't have anyone on that level. Joseph was even more shocked than he was before. This was truly a mind-boggling thing to hear. If it weren't for his undying trust on his information network, he would have thought he was lying. A nascent spirit cultivator dying from someone not even at that same level? That was absurd. It was the same thing as a single ant killing and toppling an elephant by himself. Nascent spirit cultivators were supposed to be people nearing godhood itself. They were invincible against those in the body formation realm. Yet, according to the report, this was exactly what happened. Joseph was so shocked by this that he couldn't help but just sit in his chair in silence. Sir Joseph, we've had a very fruitful discussion. But it is time for you to go, Michael said. We are quite busy. As you said, we have a lot of things to worry about regarding this problem. Joseph looked up at Michael. It was at this point that he was starting to understand that he was not dealing with a naive kid way above his head. No, Michael was a shark too. Many people thought that he was a helpless fish in a tank full of bigger fishes waiting to consume him. Joseph thought that too. But as it turned out, they should be the ones worrying about their own companies instead. Joseph was no exception. Finally, he understood why Michael and the Rebornians looked so confident despite everything that was happening. They had the wealth, they had the influence. And now they were proving that they had the strength. Joseph stood up, realizing that his requests had been a fruitless endeavor from the get-go. Michael and the Reborn Company had no intention of taking shade in a bigger company. No, they had the full intention of becoming their own shade. And he wasn't the only one. His allies, the ones supporting him, had that same look on their eyes. They were gunning for the top. I understand when I'm not wanted, he said to Michael. Then with a nod, he turned around and left the room. And as soon as he opened the door, someone jostled through him, before rushing over to Michael. Oh, my dear sweet boy, Lilia shouted. Chapter 1051 Ambushing a Nascent Spirit. Chapter 1051 Ambushing a Nascent Spirit. Joseph quickly turned back, catching the face of the woman that just passed him by. She looked familiar. He recognized her. Where did he recognize her? He knew that face. He just couldn't quite place it in his memory. The door closed, but Joseph still couldn't quite get the thought out of his mind. Lilia. That was her name. He was sure of that. But where did he hear that name? He was 100% certain that he knew her, not personally, but through another person close to him. An acquaintance, a family member he did not know. Let's go back, he said to his guard. I need to research something. Now that his meeting was done with Joseph Vanderbilt was done, Michael wanted to focus on the obvious, the aftermath of their automobile factory's destruction. However, oh my dear Michael. Michael found himself getting suffocated by his mother's smothering hug. It's okay, dear. Your mother's here to comfort you, Lilia said. It's nice to see you again, Miss Lilia. Yuna greeted her. Yuna. Oh dear. I've missed you too. It's been too long, she said, finally letting go of her grasp on Michael. Michael took a deep breath. For a second there, he truly thought he'd suffocate. Mom. What are you doing here? Lilia turned back, still holding both Yuna's arms. What do you mean, what am I doing here? I'm here to comfort you. I heard about what happened and it's truly despicable what those old fools will do to keep their spots. And for what? For pride. Foolish bastards, she said with contempt. Don't worry, son. I'll make sure that those old farts won't do anything to you, she said. I'm thankful, Mom, but I don't think they'll change just because you'll give them a stern talking to. 9:25. She put her hands on her waist. Oh, we'll see about that. Michael shook his head. His mother was just understandably angry after what happened. She was just being overprotective. You weren't hurt, were you? He shook his head. At this point, only an atomic bomb could hurt him. However, it was a fact that some of the orcs were hurt badly during the explosion. 5 incurred third-degree burns. Thankfully, they were magnetics and their natural robustness allowed them to heal better. In hindsight, Michael found it fortunate that only 5 of them were hurt. If he hadn't told the orcs to take a vacation, then more of them would have been stationed at the factory and gotten hurt. From their investigations, it seemed that the explosion came from an artifice overload. Even 1,000 shadow orcs couldn't have stopped that. The only casualty they had was the newly constructed automobile. Because of that, they had to pause the automobile orders and pause the great momentum they got from the opening ceremony that drew thousands of spectators. Narito Sasuke. How are things? 2 shadows appeared from the corner of the room and presented themselves to Michael. Boo Tutu, we've hit them where it hurts, Lord Michael. One of their largest beast farms have completely halted their production, giving them tremendous financial losses. Ratata. Our orcs are relishing at the sheer frantic panicking that those humans are currently experiencing. Thanks to their amazing shadow skills, they were able to track down the TriStar Company's main beast farm back at their homeland. There, they encountered an even more formidable opponent than the ersatz strongholds. They didn't have the sheer numbers like those ersatz magnetics, but they did have high-leveled cultivators that were worth hundreds of low-leveled magnetics on their own. Not only that, but they were led by a first-stage nascent spirit magnetic who was protecting the beast farm on his own. When Michael heard this, even he was surprised. He told them to stand down at first because he knew that fighting against a nascent spirit magnetic was far too dangerous for them at their current level. But the orcs thought differently. They wanted to attack. From their first investigations, it seemed that the nascent spirit cultivator had his guard completely let down. He was sleeping in his room without any guards. After all, no one could have thought that he'd be attacked right in the middle of their home base. He did hear that their company was attacking another company, but he knew that their opponent was a mere lower echelon organization, so he thought he was safe. That wrong assumption would have ended up costing him his life. When Michael deployed the shadow orcs, he supplemented them with all the weapons they had available. This meant all 1615 drones he had available. And as an added bonus, he also deployed all 11 of his Unity clones. They were stronger than body formation cultivators, but weaker than a nascent spirit magnetic. One-on-one against a true nascent spirit, his clone would surely lose. But with all 11 of them, plus his drones as backup, they actually stood a great chance. So, despite the risks, he allowed the orcs to go ahead with the plan. They disseminated their shadows throughout the entire beast farm, making sure they had everything prepared before they made their move. Then, while his guard was down, the shadow orcs unleashed all of their power on the nascent spirit cultivator. Michael watched everything through his mini-drone, and he saw that the cultivator actually woke up at the moment they were about to attack. The man's eyes widened with surprise and shock. Then, he saw that a mirage of steel knight armor began to manifest around him. This was his nascent spirit armor. Michael commanded his drones and his clones to attack him. He didn't want to give the cultivator a chance to awaken that armor. If he did, their chances of winning would plummet. His clones appeared on top of the cultivator, pinning him to the ground. Then, with their other hand, they used their arms to point their index fingers at his head. Behind them, the mini-drones emitted the same power. A moment later, thousands of prismatic beams of light penetrated deep into the man's skull, killing him instantly. Chapter 1052 Preparations against TriStar. Chapter 1052 Preparations against TriStar. Against all odds, the Shadow Orcs, drones, and his clones were able to kill a first-stage nascent spirit cultivator. Of course, they did it when he was caught off guard and before he was able to manifest his nascent spirit armor fully. But it was still impressive nonetheless. This proved to Michael that nascent spirit cultivators could be killed even without being one himself. He just needed thousands of drones and 11 faux nascent spirit unity clones to do so. And this was a true death too. He wasn't just a nascent spirit piece like the ones that Michael killed before. This man remained as a corpse even after death, making this feat all the more real. After that, the rest of their invasion was easy. The orcs disabled their defenses and blocked off their means of escape, while the drones and clones unleashed their fury. That was how they destroyed a main base of a ranked 41st Upper Echelon company all in a day's work. Michael lost a lot of money from the destruction of the automobile factory, but definitely not as much as what the TriStar company would lose because of this. Finally, they achieved retribution. But Michael knew that this was far from over. This would surely incur the wrath of the TriStar company, which he expected. He'd be ready for them this time. And if they could, they would have made the first move. They would have destroyed more of their main bases. Unfortunately, the TriStar company was quickly alerted of what happened after the death of their nascent spirit cultivator. Surely, they'd increase their defenses after this. Their nascent spirit cultivators won't let down their guard anytime soon. So, he quickly ordered everyone to return back to New Sparta. At least here, TriStar won't be able to deploy all of their forces to retaliate. If they did, they'd be outing themselves as the perpetrator of the automobile factory's destruction. And the Montgomery family won't take kindly to an upper echelon company bullying a lower organization. "We've left a few of our shadow clones on their base," said Naruto. "We'll find out if they start deploying their forces to New Sparta. We won't have to worry about a frontal attack, they're not that stupid," Yuna assured everybody. "They'll attack Reborn some other way. Castell, I think you must prepare for that." Castell nodded, taking Yuna's warning to heart. Michael kept silent. Although he was fully committed to fighting against the TriStar company, he couldn't help but feel a little bit unsure. There was a small part of him that wondered if he was doing the right thing. Fighting against an upper echelon so early in their growth could certainly spell their doom. "Mom, are we doing the right thing here?" Lilia's face softened. She walked over to Michael and caressed his cheeks. "It's only been a few months since we've seen each other, and you grew so much already. You've been so busy. You don't even know you've already turned 14. But no matter what happens, no matter how tall you get, no matter how much your hair covers your face, you're still our little boy. Your father and I will always support you, no matter what." Michael smiled, feeling a lot better. Mothers had the uncanny ability to always be there whenever their child needed them the most. "Now let's talk about something more important. Yuna, have you already made good progress on that?" "Okay, that's enough for now. Thanks for visiting, Mom," he said as he began pushing Lilia out of the room. "Yuna dear, call and text me sometime, okay? Oh, and give your parents a phone, so that I could talk to them sometime." Michael closed the door before he died from embarrassment. He shook himself and reminded himself that they were still at a state of war against an upper echelon. They needed to think of their next move. The most sensible action for them was to start empowering themselves while their opponent was still reeling from their attack. Thankfully, they had the means and the opportunity to do so. "How many of the shadow orcs are able to advance to the next level?" he asked the chieftains. The two orcs flashed a smile. As it turned out, the answer to his question was, all of them. All shadow orc magnetics found their hearts beating wildly for more Godforge pieces, a good indication that they'd reached the threshold for an advancement. Not only that, but it seemed that even more mortal orcs finally found themselves eligible to become a magnetic. About 2,000 more were ready to transcend their mortality. Michael had no doubt that it was probably due to the presence of the nascent spirit cultivator. Even if they were only standing by the sidelines as the drones and clones ambushed the nascent spirit cultivator, they were still in a pretty dangerous situation. If things had gone wrong, it would take the cultivator less effort than breathing to kill the mortal shadow orcs. So, by mere fact that they didn't cower and retreat from the fight allowed them to awaken their talents and the possibility of their divas to awaken. Now, there were 4,000 magnetics among the shadows. Of course, this meant that their Godforge pieces would have to be distributed amongst 4,000 members. But thankfully, they had an abundance of money to spend on Godforge pieces. He ordered Shiina to begin taking a record on how much kilos they needed in total. It was a staggering amount, he was sure. All in all, though, he was very much glad that everyone in their company was advancing their cultivation. The Dragonborns, the orcs, everyone was doing well. And hopefully he'll be able to do so as well. Did you bring it? He asked the two orc chieftains. Naruto and Sasuke both gestured with their hands, conjuring a shadow in the ground. In the black, tenebrous hole, a glowing spherical object ascended into the air. Michael stared at it. This was a nascent spirit core. Chapter 1053 Nascent Spirit Core. Chapter 1053 Nascent Spirit Core. After killing the nascent spirit cultivator, Michael noticed something in the corpse's chest. It was glowing with ability power, still pumping out with the strength of a magnetic. At first, he was wary, thinking that the cultivator was still alive. Thankfully, he was not. It was just the leftover Godforge pieces that the nascent spirit cultivator used. This is his heart? He asked. A magnetic stores their Godforge pieces in their heart. Specifically, the mysterious and godlike metal coats the outer layer of the heart, and somehow imbues the person with reality-altering powers. And whenever they took the Godforge pieces from a dead magnetic using their natural magnetism, they only attracted the individual drops. But this time, the entire core was taken out. Michael held out his hand, beckoning for the Godforge pieces to come to him. Coming from a nascent spirit cultivator, this core must have a minimum of 45 kilos of Godforge pieces inside. But instead of drops, the entire thing beckoned to his hand instead. Perhaps this was just a unique instance, or it was just something natural for nascent spirit cultivators. He didn't know. After all, he knew next to nothing about the next stage of diva cultivation. He didn't actually know how nascent spirit cultivators advanced their cultivation. For body formation magnetics, they simply needed Godforge pieces to coat their entire heart. This would allow their diva to awaken their entire essence. But for nascent spirit cultivators, things weren't as simple. Their powers didn't seem to derive from simply getting more Godforge pieces. Sure, it was still an integral part of their cultivation. The fact that this core full of Godforge pieces had now replaced the man's heart meant that the nascent spirit realm must involve making this core bigger. As to how, he didn't know. And if he didn't know, he would never be able to transcend the body formation. I'm gonna have to ask Katarina how to do it. Unfortunately, she'd been missing in action for quite a while now. It seemed that the destruction of the two ersatz strongholds had busied her much more than he thought. I wish there was a way for me to research this. Just as he thought that, he suddenly heard a notification from deep in his subconscious. Request granted. I will deconstruct the nascent spirit core from the inside out to find out its secrets. You can do that. Certainly. Now please consume the object. Michael staggered for a second. Consume? Like eat? Please do not eat the nascent spirit core. You can simply touch it with your palms and I will use it to make contact with the item. Relieved that he didn't have to open his jaws like a titan, he walked forward and touched the floating nascent spirit core. It was hot. Blazingly hot. Having that reflective metallic appearance like that of a steel ball made him completely forget that this thing was made out of pure Godforge pieces. And upon contact with the air, Godforge pieces combust in unity flames that manifest as a white fire. It seemed that this core was so condensed with Godforge pieces that the fire had now turned into plasma, which was why it had that white glow that surrounded it. And unfortunately, even his own absolute unity defense couldn't protect him fully from the core's heat. His prismatic shield sizzled as it made contact with the sphere. Despite being in the 9th stage of the body formation realm, there was still a chasm between him and a first-stage nascent spirit cultivator. He braved the blazing heat until his palms finally touched the nascent spirit core. At that same instant, ChatJK5 finally roared to life. Nanoparticles manifested out of his palms, before beginning to surround the entirety of the nascent core. Except, this wasn't the same nanoparticles that he saw when his drones underwent upgrades. These drones were more like termites rather than worker bees. They began to consume the nascent spirit core, chipping away at it in record time. Within a few seconds, the entirety of the core was reduced to nothing. Michael didn't know where they went. They didn't get absorbed into his body. He'd know. Instead, they went somewhere else. Godforge pieces just don't get destroyed or lost like that. They weren't called the strongest material in the world for nothing. Software update commencing. Progress. 0.01%. Michael's eyes widened as he read those words. Finally. It had been such a long time after ChatJK5's software update. I guess you'd be ChatJK6 now after the update. How long do you think this will take? Time remaining. Unknown. That was new. Usually, she knew exactly when the update would finish. But it seemed that the complexity of the nascent spirit core was too much to comprehend in a short amount of time. Thankfully though, ChatJK5 had advanced far enough that she was still active even while undergoing a software update. If it was in her previous versions, he wouldn't even be able to talk to her. Now, the update was downloading in the background. Basically, he didn't have to worry about it until after the update was finished loading. Then, he'd probably need to sleep in order to reset the system. He was like a phone in that case. Either way, this was extremely good news, especially with their fight against an upper echelon. "Let's start our planning," he shouted with excitement. For their first order of business, Michael and Castell discussed the automobile factory. Since that would be their main form of revenue for the foreseeable future, it was imperative that they had the factory up and running as soon as possible. Creating it would be easy enough. The orcs had already done it once. They could easily do it again in even less time than before. The problem was, should they? If they created another factory, they'd just be inviting another attack. "Maybe we should think of some defensive measures for the next factory. What do you think, Kong?" He turned to the yellow manky chief engineer, and he had his eyes closed. At the same moment, Michael felt something knocking from his shadow inventory. He'd seen this before. Chapter 1054 Magnetic Man-Key. Chapter 1054 Magnetic Man-Key. Kong closed his eyes. Even though no one blamed him, he took responsibility for the destruction of the automobile factory. He could have done more. If he had just reinforced the walls with better materials, if he had incorporated a little bit more defenses, if he had warnings and extinguishers in place, he could have prevented this entire thing from happening. Boss Michael entrusted this job to him, and he failed. Plain and simple. Because of his mistake, Rebornians could have died. His allies and friends were hurt. He had to be better. And in that moment, he felt something inside him stir. Michael felt the change in the air. He looked down at his feet, his shadow inventory having been summoned of its own will. The Godforge pieces were knocking, begging to be let out. He let them. The tenebrous hole in the ground began spitting out flaming white flaming stars. Then, these individual drops of Godforge began to move towards the yellow man-key. They were attracted to him, and as if they were caught in his gravitational field, they began to fall conically towards his chest. Michael and the rest of the chief officers of Reborn marveled at this sight. Bu-tu-tu. A birth of a new comrade. Ra-ta-ta. Ha 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 ha. I knew this would happen. I've always felt that Kong was one talented man-key. Soon, Kong's heart was satiated of its hunger. A small part of its exterior was now coated in a shiny, metallic surface akin to that of aluminum. It was just enough for the first stage of the body formation realm. Then a subtle shockwave. A misty constellation of lights began to gather above his head, before condensing to form a gigantic baboon with a bustling modern city perching atop its head. It was a diva. Kong slowly opened his eyes, his irises now showing a different kind of light than before. It seemed brighter too. "Boss Michael, at your service," Kong said, kneeling towards him. Once again, he was bequeathed a power that he did not deserve. He was given a second chance to right his wrong, make it so that his work of arts wouldn't be destroyed ever again. "How do you feel?" he asked. Kong looked at his hands. "This is truly magnificent, boss. I feel as if my mind has expanded 100 times as it was before." This was the second non-combat magnetic to awaken for the Rebornians. Michael still didn't know a lot about their capabilities, but he was sure that an expanded intelligence was just one of the side effects of awakening. Kong must have a different power altogether, he just didn't know it yet. "Kong, can you help us figure out our next move for the automobile factory?" Michael asked, nudging the man-key's intuition. Surely, his ability power had something to do with engineering and city planning like his talent. And just as Michael thought that, Kong suddenly raised his head in a sudden realization. "Yes, boss," Kong replied. Then, he raised his hand and began molding the very air in front of him. Michael's eyes widened as he and the others began to see a solid structure form under his gentle molding. It actually looked like he was a god molding the world itself. This wasn't magic. Kong was actually changing the air into a completely different structure entirely. It seemed that Kong wasn't even aware that he was doing this. He was so excited and caught up in his own work that he was completely entranced by himself. Eventually, almost half of the room was occupied by a giant concrete building that had some similarity to the automobile factory from before. Except, there were some noticeable differences. The previous factory was simply a rectangular box, focusing entirely on practicality over aesthetic. But now, the building looked like one of those highly artistic structures that fully expressed the architect's vision and creativity, essentially becoming an engineer's nightmare. It looked hard to build. But the fact that Kong built it using only his hands and the air meant that it was a lot more feasible than Michael thought. "It's done, boss," Kong proudly said. The new automobile factory was basically a Mobius strip. A single strip of building that had a half twist that made it have only one edge and one side. "It looks beautiful," Yuna commented. "Thank you, Miss Boss. It is not only beautiful but practical as well," Kong said. The yellow man-key used both of his hands and created a large split in the Mobius strip factory. And through this midsection, they were able to see the entirety of the building's interior. Everyone was shocked to see a functioning mini-sized factory line inside. At the very top of the Mobius strip started the process of creating an automobile. And as it passed through the perimeter of the Mobius strip, its parts were created, molded, and painted until it was fully assembled back at the top of the strip. Michael picked up one of the finished cars inside. It looked realistic in his hands, as if an automobile was actually shrunk into a size that could fit squarely atop his palms. "We will be able to create 1,000 automobiles in a single day," Kong announced. This was a big upgrade. Before, they were only able to produce 100. This would literally increase their profits tenfold. Not only that, but each section of the Mobius automobile factory is entirely separate from one another. Meaning, if one is caught on fire, it will not spread to the other side, making repair a lot easier. Michael didn't know how Kong did it. This kind of design literally looked impossible. But then again, magnetics were known to not be tethered by reality. They made their own. But of course, this is just in the worst-case scenario. I've incorporated a new kind of defense in order to protect everyone inside. Chapter 1055 Compromise Given and Taken. Chapter 1055 Compromise Given and Taken. Kong pointed at the very outside of the building. "Boss Michael, I envision the factory to be capable of withstanding an explosion that would level an entire city," Kong said, his eyes glazing with yearning. Michael was surprised. Those were some big words. "What, are you going to use mithril artifacts to enforce the walls or something?" he joked. Kong smiled. "No, boss. Just Damascus steel." "Oh, that wasn't bad." In fact, the factory's previous foundation was also made with Damascus steel. Yet, it still couldn't withstand the destructive nature of a volatile artifice explosion. "Then how is it going to be so tough as you said?" Kong proudly smiled. "Because I designed it so." Everyone turned to the yellow man-key, waiting for him to say his next words. Perhaps he had some kind of new technique that he used. Or maybe he was going to use a much more durable material than before. But instead, Kong was just basing it all off on his own opinion. "How can you be so sure?" Michael asked again. Kong stared straight back at Michael with a look of absolute confidence. "Because I made it, boss. I don't know why, but I feel that as long as I watch over the creation of this factory, then I'd be able to make it grow and become more durable than what was even possible." This was not such a surprising turn of events. It seemed that Kong's ability power had something to do with the construction of a building project. Either it could bolster its defenses or whatnot, Michael did not know. But it seemed that he would just have to trust his chief engineer on this one. He'd do what was best for the nation of Reborn. "All right, I trust you, Kong," he said. "Now, let's talk about the actual construction of this project. What's the timetable for the whole thing?" Castell immediately issued a suggestion. "We must have it constructed in no more than 3 days," she said. "It's not ideal for us to have such a delay in automobile production." This seemed fast, but given how the previous factory was only constructed in a day or so, it didn't seem all that bad. But it seemed that Kong had other plans. "No, Miss Castell. That is not possible. This project should take a week to create. And it would be even better if we do it longer." "What? Why?" Castell barked back. "We've already seen what rushing will do," Kong replied. "This time, we must make sure that the automobile factory is without any vulnerabilities that our enemies can exploit." The two department chiefs butted heads for the first time. Castell, as CEO of the company, wanted nothing more than to continue their progress into becoming a legitimate upper echelon member of the market. That was the only way they were going to compete in New Sparta. But that can't happen if they couldn't get their automobile factory pumping units like crazy. It would hamper their momentum. On the other hand, Kong, as the chief engineer of the nation of Reborn, wanted to focus on nothing but creating the best construction in the world. And if they were going to rush it, then they would end up with another lackluster job like the factory. Both of them had good points and both were correct, at least in their perspectives. One focused on the bigger picture while one focused on the details. Castell and Kong were adamant in their own choices and would not back down, which left the ultimate decision to Michael, their leader. This was a true dilemma. Like Castell, he wanted to continue their company's momentum. However, he also understood that good things couldn't be rushed. Was there any way that he could satisfy both? And after some thought, Michael made a decision. "Let's compromise," he said. "We'll start the construction of the Mobius factory ASAP, focusing entirely on the production line itself. If we're not focusing on the defenses and the other paraphernalia, then we'll be able to finish it in Castell's timeframe." Michael proposed to construct the factory only halfway through before they started the production. Kong opened his mouth, about to say something, but Michael continued on. "Once we have the basic factory line ready, we'll start the production of the automobiles. At the same time, we'll continue with the construction and build any defenses or paraphernalia that Kong desires. At that point, it can take as long as you want. Of course, there was still the matter of safety. In the meantime, I'll be taking charge and monitoring the factory itself before everything is complete. That way, we won't have to worry about accidents and ambushes. It was a good compromise. Castell would have what she needed to progress the company, while Kong would have the time he wanted to perfect the Mobius factory. Everybody won. Of course, this would mean he'll be entirely occupied until the full construction of the factory. But that was a small sacrifice he was willing to make. I'm fine with this, young master. Thank you, Boss Michael. With that settled, Kong began finalizing the construction plans. He fetched for the other Rebornian engineers and construction workers so that they could fully understand their plan in the upcoming days. And while all of that was happening, Michael and Castell began discussing their next phase of plans. Young master, it's about time, isn't it? He nodded. Yes, they're probably going to need a refuel soon. That was right. One of the reasons why they wanted to disseminate and spread automobiles as far as possible was because the automobile itself was not their end goal. It was fuel. Even if in the future the conglomerates managed to build their own automobiles, which they were probably working on right now, the Reborn company would still control the oil they need. After all, the parched lands were the only rich natural resource full of untapped crude oil. We'll need to start building gas stations and gas pumps in New Sparta, Castell said. Then we must also prepare the logistics of fuel delivery, Shiina added. We will be deploying trucks every weekend back to the nation of Reborn to fill up our gas pumps in New Sparta. Of course, that must be well planned out too. It was another way that they could be ambushed. Don't worry, Lord Michael. We'll have our shadows monitoring everything going in and out, said Naruto. Boo Tutu, if they dare to attack us again, we'll have our revenge. Michael didn't have to worry about that. If there was one thing that the shadow orcs were good at, then it was espionage. Now that they were aware of the possibilities, they wouldn't get caught blindsided again. Michael wanted Kong to redesign the gas stations and pumps that they were going to install in New Sparta. So, he walked over to their side of the meeting room to consult with him about it. In a giant open space, Kong stood in front of about 3,000 Rebornians, all looking up at him with serious expressions. At the very front were Mankeys and various demi-humans who wore clean polo shirts and an overall smart attire. They were engineers. There were a few hundred of them. Behind them were the Rebornian construction workers, who wore nothing but oily overalls and dirty shirts. They didn't look as clean as the engineers, but they were the backbone of Reborn. The few thousands of them here were the reason why they were able to make a utopia in a desolate desert. Kong pointed back at the miniature model of the Mobius factory behind himself. He was explaining to them the plans for construction, telling everyone of their respective duties. Michael didn't want to interrupt. He turned away to leave. But just as he was about to turn away from the door, he suddenly felt something stir in his shadow inventory. His eyes widened. Again, he was once again feeling the sensation of Godforge pieces begging to be let out of their confinement. Someone's about to become a magnetic. Michael was elated with this discovery. It seemed that someone in his room was eligible to be chosen by a Godforge piece. He quickly summoned his shadow inventory in front of him. And immediately, flaming white drops of Godforge shot out from the tenebrous, shadowy hole. Michael's face turned from excitement to pure shock and disbelief. After all, there weren't just 1 or 2 kilos of Godforge getting out. There were thousands of them. It looked like his shadow inventory was puking out constellation after constellation. The room of engineers and construction workers found themselves startled at the appearance of the Godforge pieces. They stared up in wonder at the cluster of flaming white drops that began to circle and rotate like that of a galaxy. Then, one by one, they dropped, straight down into the hearts of every single one of the Rebornians here. 3,000 of them were becoming a magnetic. Chapter 1056 Construction Worker Magnetics. Chapter 1056 Construction Worker Magnetics. Yuna, Shiina, and Castell immediately rushed to the room as soon as they heard the commotion. Felt it was the more correct term. The simultaneous awakening of 3,000 magnetics ought to cause a slight shift in the atmosphere for other magnetics. This is amazing, Yuna said excitedly. Truthfully, Michael wasn't expecting all of them to become a magnetic. But in hindsight, it made sense. During the entire construction period where the Shadow Orcs took over, they weren't alone. They were always supervised by the mortal Rebornian engineers and construction workers. They were there throughout the blood, sweat, and tears. It seemed that during that time, they were able to familiarize themselves with ability power, courtesy of the Shadow Orcs always showing off their powers during drinking. This planted the seed in their hearts. They saw how the orcs could shape the very reality they had in front of their hands and change it to whatever they wanted. As people who worked in the creativity sector, the prospect of molding reality into something else was very alluring. They would have felt the yearning to become a magnetic during that time. Then, the destruction of the automobile factory happened. Just like the Shadow Orcs, They too felt the immense pain and heartbreak seeing their hard work burning into a pile of rubble. That was the catalyst to their ascension. It lit the fire into their hearts, urging them to become stronger so that this wouldn't happen again. And now they had the power to fulfill that very wish. Each and every one of them closed their eyes as they felt the change within their bodies. They felt the heat within their veins, some worrying if this was good for them or not. At that moment, the whole room suddenly erupted in a rhythmic pattern. Bu-tu-tu, bu-tu-tu, ra-ta-ta, ra-ta-ta. The shadow orcs appeared to the side, shouting their tribal chants in a harmonic pattern. Their energizing shouts added with the beats of their bodies created a guide for the awakening Rebornians. With the help of the shadow orcs, these newly minted magnetics were finding themselves much more comfortable with their own change. It was as if the Bu-to-tos and Ra-ta-ts became a guiding light that led them to the end of a dark tunnel. And as they did, they reached a substantial change. A misty constellation of lights appeared above their heads, slowly revolving upon one another and converging into one single point. Then, a new figure appeared amidst the mist. Their divas were awakening. Above the engineers, humanoid divas wearing various academic and formal attires appeared. They had the countenance of a professor or a dignified engineer or architect. For the construction workers, various animals who had great physical capabilities appeared. As expected of their profession, tenacity, strength, and camaraderie were key to success. Seeing the sight of thousands of non-combat magnetics in front of him, Michael nodded to himself. This was proof that ability power was not only useful to physical strength but mental strength as well. Kong immediately convened with the rest of his new magnetic comrades. And a couple of seconds later, they came to a simple conclusion. "Boss, we'll be able to create the Mobius automobile factory today," he said confidently. Kong's estimate of 1 week or more was because he'd be taking on the burden of creation by himself. But now, with hundreds of engineers and thousands of construction workers by his side, all equipped with their own divas and ability power, that estimate was quickly slashed down. "That's great," Castell praised. "Would you also be able to create the gas station pumps in that time frame?" Kong turned towards the rest of his engineers. They convened for a few seconds, before they all nodded. "Yes," he said. "We will be able to incorporate a new design onto the gas stations as well. This one will have the same foundational design as the Mobius factory." "Leave it to us, boss." "TSK, a day? We'll finish that in a few hours. With this new power pumping through my veins, I can do all of this without sleeping." The rest of the construction workers pumped up their fists in accordance to the plans Kong cooked up for them. Despite the amazingly harsh schedule he gave them, they still felt as if they could do better than what they were given. "Can you really do this?" he asked, but his question was soon proven moot. The construction workers were already well on their way out. It seemed that they were getting ready to start production on the Mobius factory and didn't want to delay any longer. Michael was really curious as to how they were going to do it, so he quickly followed them to where they were going. The shadow orcs helped the construction workers teleport to their designated location, a few tens of kilometers outside New Sparta. He noticed that they weren't that far off from the previous location of the automobile factory. In fact, they were in the exact same location. The charred rubble strewn around the empty grounds still gave him an ache in the heart. The Rebornians gave the fallen automobile factory a moment of silence before they began their work. Kong and the hundreds of engineer magnetics worked first. They stood in a group with the chief engineer at the lead. Kong raised his hand, the cosmic-sized baboon diva appearing above his head. Then he began molding the air. Soon enough, the basic edge outline of the Mobius strip factory appeared amongst the rubble. The new building was 3 times as large as the old one, yet that didn't seem to affect the workers at all. After that, he gave way for the hundreds of engineers to give their input. Their divas manifested, and despite being only created a few minutes ago, they began spooling out their ability powers towards the factory outline. It wasn't long before a 3-dimensional blueprint appeared in front of them. Michael noticed that there was something different with it this time. Chapter 1057 Reborn Creationists. Chapter 1057 Reborn Creationists. The outlines were suffused with ability power. Yeah, Kong and the engineers used their new magnetic powers to create this, but he didn't think it would be made out of ability power threads. While he was thinking that, the construction workers began their work. They stepped into the edge outline of the Mobius factory and began to hammer their fists onto the empty space. At first, he didn't know what they were doing. But when he used his drone vision to see through the magnetic filter of the world, his eyes widened with surprise. The construction workers were fastening their ability powers into reality. They were using their arms and their diva's body as a hammer, and their ability power threads as nails in this construction project. It wasn't long before the foundational pillars were created using no materials whatsoever. It was made only through ability power and nothing else. Michael was astounded by what they were doing. Their plans of using Damascus steel for the main material for their foundation was completely scrapped. Instead, they found something better. Ability power threads. Actually, he didn't know if this was better or not. Was ability power more durable than Damascus steel? Than mithril artifacts? He didn't know. But it had the possibility of being so, which was enough for him to trust that his engineers and construction workers were doing the right thing. Michael marveled at the speed at which they were creating this project. They were all moving with perfect speed and efficiency, with no wasted movements whatsoever. They seemed like they were in a perpetual state of being in the zone. Perhaps it was because they were still high from transcending their mortality. Or better yet, it could be a permanent buff they achieved by becoming a non-combat magnetic. He was so entranced with their work that he ended up watching them the whole way through. He and Yuna couldn't get their eyes off of them. By the first hour, the entire structure of the Mobius factory was completed. In normal terms, they were already at the 30% completion mark, where the rough shape of the building was constructed with concrete. This would usually take a few weeks in his past life or a few days in this world. But now it just took an hour. It was a weird sight. The construction workers would swing their arms in the empty air for a few minutes. Then suddenly, at their last swing, a simple metallic edge railing would manifest out of thin air. The second hour passed by, and the windows, ledges, and doors were all completed. Everyone moved to the interior. Here, the engineers once again took over the work. They began unspooling their ability power and creating the outline in which the construction workers were going to follow. Individual rooms were created. The electric wiring was settled. And the machines for the automobile factory lines were given space. By the third hour, it seemed that everything was complete. There were only the small details left, like the light switches, the air conditioners, and other mundane stuff like that. At the fourth hour, Kong and the rest of the workers were proud to say that they had completed their project. They celebrated this momentous occasion by firing the automobile factory line for the first time, showing how a car was made from scratch. Interestingly enough, they had to use normal materials for the creation of that automobile. Previously, the construction workers used nothing but their ability power threads to create everything in the factory. Even the complicated robotic arms and metal molds were made through their magnetic powers. But the automobiles themselves were made with normal materials. Boss, we present to you the combined efforts of the Rebornian creationists. Mobius Factory 1.0. Kong was all smiles as he presented this to Michael. Michael was speechless. Not only was this much faster than he originally estimated, but it was also made from a completely different material entirely. Ability power. From a normal perspective, they looked like natural materials. But when he used his drone vision, everything turned into a complicated weaving of ability power threads that intertwined with each other to create a tapestry of massive proportions. And he saw that each and every single one who worked on the Mobius factory were connected with their work one way or another. A single ability power thread spooled out of their hearts, and connected with the network of threads in the factory. It makes sense. They're connected since this is basically made out of their own power. It was like how Michael was connected to every single one of his switch or battery, and he had to use natural materials from the ground to create those. The construction workers used purely their ability powers. Kong, do you feel connected to the Mobius factory? The Mankey chief engineer nodded fervently. Yes, boss. As if it was my own hand. Me too. I can feel the factory no matter how far I am from it. The other engineers and construction workers felt the same, though probably not as deep as Kong. A thread as thick as a rope spooled out of Kong's heart and connected with the factory. It was the biggest connection compared to others. Boss, I feel as if this factory is my own spawn, can grow much more, as long as we guide it and feed it with the right sustenance. Michael was intrigued. The factory can grow? Was it the same thing with his drone? Could this factory be the equivalent of a drone to Kong? If so, it would make sense why he felt that he could upgrade the factory into something better. Kong simply didn't have an AI assistant to express that into a ready-to-understand user interface like what he saw. That could be Kong's ability power. Everything he creates has the potential to grow. This was very interesting because the entire factory was made out of ability power, which meant that it scaled in tandem with its creators. As they grew, the factory grew with them. Chapter 1058 in with the new? Chapter 1058 in with the new? Meanwhile, back in New Sparta, the companies and organizations inside were just finding out about the explosive news of the automobile factory. Someone attacked them? That is really unfortunate, but I can't say I'm surprised. They're stepping on a lot of toes with their new product. But they really attacked them so blatantly? When it's rumored that Zir Montgomery herself is posing to enter New Sparta. They must be courting death. They're desperate. We're extremely fortunate that we won't be negatively affected much by the appearance of the automobiles. In fact, it will only increase our efficiency and productivity by hundreds. But for others, they could literally face demotion to the lower brackets. I could understand why they'd go to such lengths. The official story was that there was an unfortunate explosive accident that destroyed the automobile factory. Something about a spontaneous volcanic eruption or something like that. Everyone knew it was a bogus explanation, and under closed doors they were discussing to themselves about who was responsible for such hits. And eventually they did find out. Not through their extensive information network, but through another explosive incident. The TriStar Beastly Company just had their main farm raided in a matter of a single day. Most people thought this was a coincidence. After all, the two incidents happened on the same day, just a few hours apart. Not only that, but the TriStar's main farm was located on the upper side of the royal continent. But what's strange about this was that the TriStar Company stayed silent throughout it all. They uttered not a single peep. Usually, this kind of provocation would have sent them blustering through everyone they meet, asking for justice and whatnot. They would have complained to the Montgomery family. They would have issued an investigation on whoever attacked them so that they could get the retribution that they deserved. But they stayed silent. It wasn't just because they were too shocked about what happened. But the higher-ups of the TriStar Company were adamant about keeping silent about the whole affair. They reported it as another unfortunate accident. This was very weird behavior, unless they had something to hide. If the Montgomerys investigated them, then they might find something that would implicate them in a crime. It wasn't long before people connected the dots. They were the ones responsible for the destruction of the automobile factory. The motive was their stallion business would stand to lose more than half of their revenue because of the automobiles. But what they were really surprised about was the fact that the Reborn company's attack was even swifter than the wind. Somehow, they were able to figure out the culprit of the attack and seek their own revenge all in the same day. But how could they? Okay, sure. They had the automobile, which would explain how they were able to travel all the way there to the upper region of the royal continent in record time. But how were they able to destroy the TriStar main farm? They were an upper echelon company. What? That's not possible. You must be mistaken. A nascent spirit cultivator was killed. It's just a first stage. Then this must mean that the Reborn company has their own allies. The more people thought about it, the more it made sense. The Reborn company must have allies among the upper echelons. While half of the companies there would suffer from the surge of automobiles, half would also benefit greatly. With this great upheaval in the market, companies were bound to fall from their rankings. And this would mean that there was a chance for other companies to rise. And if they were to ally themselves with the Reborn company, they could have access to their automobiles much more easily than others, giving them the head start they needed to rise the ranks. Essentially, this unique situation divided the companies in New Sparta into three different factions. Those who hated the appearance of automobiles, those who were neutral to it, and those who would benefit the propagation of automobiles. And under the shadows, different connections and alliances were being formed. Of course, this was not a war alliance. They weren't teaming up to physically fight the Reborn company. With such a public space such as New Sparta, no one was stupid enough to have an unsanctioned war with the Montgomerys' presence so near. Rather, this was an alliance to either keep the current status quo or destroy it. Were you willing to have automobiles dominate the world or not? The age of the automobiles was still at its infancy. There were lots of things that they could do to stagger its progress, or stop it entirely. So, as the hours passed, the companies were sorted into their respective sides. Most, about 90% of the companies ended up completely neutral. They preferred to wait in the shadows, letting the two sides battle it out so that they could benefit later in the aftermath. They weren't stupid. The dominance of automobiles seemed inevitable. But of course, they wouldn't want to help the Reborn company in this fight either. These past few days made them consider this organization as a proper opponent rather than a pest. If they helped, they could be helping Reborn defeat them in the future. Then, there was a minority who decided that an alliance with the Reborn company was the most sensible course of action. These companies sent their representatives to talk with Reborn for a possibility of an agreement. And in a complete contrast, those on the other side of this war chose not to be passive. They attacked. With the automobile factory destroyed, this was their chance to stop the momentum of automobiles spreading into the minds of the market. Rumors began to spread. Hey, did you hear? My friend just purchased his automobile, but it has already broken down into pieces. 100,000 sand dollars thrown into the dumps. Wasn't it made out of Damascus steel? That was a complete lie, I heard. If people were convinced that the automobiles were dangerous and volatile, this could destroy their reputation in the market. But that didn't work as well as they'd hoped. Chapter 1059 Article Fight. Chapter 1059 Article Fight. The cars were just too damn good. Huh? My automobile's going good. Even though this isn't the Damascus version, it survived a trip to the treacherous mountains. Unless one purposefully drove it off a cliff, the automobile would keep on running without a problem. So they had to do something more drastic. Sabotage. The roads were littered with spikes. causing a massive wave of flat tires, causing people to come and complain to the Reborn company. Since they were the only ones who could produce those tires, they'd be inundated with requests from all sides. And with their automobile factory destroyed, they wouldn't be able to fulfill those requests, leading to a lot of frustration and resentment from the general public. That would hamper their progress greatly. And the TriStar company didn't end it there. They used this chance to completely change the narrative about their mounts. The next day, their plan went into effect. Whoa, those horse crabs look massive and grand. Is a king visiting New Sparta? Oh, that sheepshell steed looks so cute. I want to get one for myself. Look, the upper echelons are still using those magic beasts. I guess it's not so bad if I use it myself. Hundreds of unique and majestic beasts roamed around New Sparta and its surrounding territories. Not only that, but they were being ridden by the most famous warriors, mages, and magnetics alike. People were amazed and influenced by them. Magical steeds were supposed to be on their way out thanks to the automobiles, but this move from the TriStar and their allies quickly rejuvenated the public perception about them. Using steeds wasn't old school. They were elite, unique, and the fact that there was a lot of negative sentiment about the automobiles, most of which were fabricated, helped TriStar push the narrative even further. This was how they were going to defeat the Reborn company, through plain, old-fashioned market bullying. Soon after the creation of the Mobius automobile factory, Michael was soon alerted of the TriStar company's tricks. Michael entered their meeting room and saw a familiar face he hadn't seen in a long time. Jimmy, how's life in Metropolis? Jimmy was the designated journalist of the Reborn company. He was vital in getting their names spread out as far as possible. Michael, my man, forget about me. We gotta talk about this. Jimmy slapped a newspaper article on the table. Everyone looked at the front page and saw the Reborn company written in bold letters. Reborn company, selling defective cars? Are automobiles dangerous? They wanted to print something more scathing, but I stopped them and made them write that question mark, Jimmy said. But I have no doubt that the other newspaper article will try to disparage our name. It's hard to stop that when the newspaper company itself is owned by an upper echelon. Jimmy told them all about the rumors and the discussions surrounding the Reborn automobiles. There was even a story propagating around that said that they were using the souls and hearts of magical beasts in order to power their heartless automobiles. Michael couldn't help but scoff. The TriStar company was the one who was using inhumane techniques to keep their magical beasts in top shape. But unfortunately, that's just how things worked around here. In fact, it wasn't much different from his previous world. With enough money, you could buy anything, even the truth. Michael won't stand for this. Jimmy, can you? The trusty journalist stood up and saluted at Michael. I've already done it, Michael. I've already written a newspaper article exposing the TriStar company for what they truly are. Scum of the earth. Thanks to your shadow orcs, I'll have enough dirt on those guys to make them regret disgracing the sanctity of journalism. Michael nodded and thanked Jimmy, but he knew that that wasn't enough. Right now, they were at a war with the TriStar company, a war that involved the future of automobiles in this world. He knew that there was only one thing to do. The stories that the TriStar company propagated only worked because of one thing, the destruction of the factory. They could say anything as long as automobiles weren't running around New Sparta. But thankfully, that was going to change. How's the Mobius factory? He asked Castell. They've already gone through the first round of production, young master. We have 1,000 units ready to deploy. Two shadows appeared behind Castell. Bu-Tutu. We have 3 elite Penumbra members always on standby in our factory, said Naruto. Ra-ta-ta. Again, we thank you for our new Godforge pieces. Lord Michael. He also spent a total of 971 kilograms of Godforge to advance the Dragonborns to the 7th stage, Jakku, Shiina, and Umisu. Then the 2 orc chieftains to the 5th stage. The 10 elite Penumbras to the 4th stage, and 1,000 high orcs to the 3rd stage. And if need be, each one of them were just 1 teleportation away from protecting the new Mobius factory. Of course, that was just the last case scenario. As it turned out, one of Kong's ability power allowed him to completely take control of the factory. This included him being able to transport the building anywhere he wanted. In hindsight, he should have known. Kong's diva was a giant, cosmic baboon who had an entire civilization perched atop its head. It seemed that Kong could do that too, though it was more metaphorical than it was real. Because of this, he was now fully confident of their factory's safety. Nothing could ambush them again. Now, it was time for them to go on the offensive. What about the gas stations? Castell gave him a sheath of paper. The engineers and the construction workers are about to be deployed in New Sparta, she said. Undoubtedly, that was going to cause a scene. But that was not their offense. He had another plan for that. Can you tell Kong to create a new stamping press? I have a few things I want him to print. Chapter 1060 Counter Announcement. Chapter 1060 Counter Announcement. Back in New Sparta, the TriStar agenda was hard at work. The combination of the automobile factory destruction, the scathing newspaper articles, as well as the resurgence of unique magical beasts made the eventual domination of automobiles halt in its place. In fact, from the surface, it even looked like it was starting to decline and return the world back to when transportation was done the good old-fashioned way. Unfortunately for the TriStar company, the other upper echelons and conglomerates couldn't be as easily swayed as the general public. Aside from their allies, everyone else was using automobiles as their main transportation. It was just too efficient. Even now, as they were getting used to driving a car, they were still finding out how good of a vehicle it was. And under the shadows, even the anti-automobile faction were still using automobiles. They were only putting on a show in public about still making use of magical beasts. After all, they'd be massively putting themselves at a disadvantage if they didn't. Because of this, the TriStar company was furious. They were livid. They spent a ton of money, hundreds of millions of sand dollars, in order to continue their smearing campaign against the automobiles. They gave away their precious magical beasts that cost millions of sand dollars for basically free just so that they could be seen by the general public. They spent millions more buying or bribing newspaper articles and public opinion. Worst of all, they did all of this while operating at a loss. One of their main sources of income, their main farm, was still destroyed. Yet, here they were finding out that their allies were still using automobiles. It looked like their efforts, those billion sand dollars, would all be in vain. I thought we had a deal. Why are you still using automobiles? A TriStar representative and their ally were currently having a heated meeting, with one side desperate, and the other nonchalant. Our deal only necessitated a public appearance with your magical beasts. We didn't talk about actually using them. The TriStar representative fumed. What about our other deal? The representative opposite him chuckled. Oh, you mean the deal where you want to borrow our automobiles? Rules for thee, but not for me. That was right. TriStar themselves were using automobiles in their day-to-day business dealings. That was the reason why they even got their magical beasts into New Sparta so fast. The irony was not lost on the TriStar company. However, what could they do? They'd lose so much more money if they stuck to their old ways and used magical beasts as their main form of transportation. I don't know what you're so worried about. You've done the job. Because you destroyed their factory, the Reborn company will experience a major setback. The TriStar representative calmed his nerves. They were right. With this major setback, the Reborn company will need a lot of time to recoup their losses. And with this time, they'd be able to think up a counter against Reborn. They'd be able to scheme. No matter how great Reborn's inventions were, they were still a far cry from becoming an upper echelon. They didn't have the strength to protect their assets, at least by themselves. The reason why the TriStar representative was so frantic was because of that exact possibility. The possibility of Reborn gaining allies. Our spies saw Joseph Vanderbilt meet with the Reborn company. We think he's the one who killed one of our nascent spirit guardians. The man opposite him frowned. Really? I guess TriStar's information network isn't that good. I heard they were rejected. What? No, that can't be possible. It was at that moment when their meeting was suddenly interrupted by a flurry of winds blowing at their sides. Two different figures emerged from out of nowhere before whispering in their ears. They just heard about Reborn's new announcement. Welcome, one and all, to the grand reopening of the Reborn automobile dealership. A loud, booming voice echoed all around New Sparta, repeating every minute or so using some kind of non-magical device. Reborn had opened its doors once again to the purchasing of automobiles. Of course, their dealership was immediately crowded by lots and lots of people, some of which were genuinely interested in buying an automobile, while some were part of the anti-automobile faction wondering how the Reborn company had the audacity to lie to its customers. Their factory was just destroyed. Soon, the warm-smiled Rebornian attendants started accepting people. One such person cut through the line and started talking big. Finally, don't you know that I've been wanting to complain? I couldn't use my brand new and expensive automobile because of a flat tire. The Rebornian Lamia smiled in return to the loud voice. Good morning, sir. As an apology for our closed business last time, we are offering a free wheel replacement for your car. We'll also refuel it for you. The rest of the people listening to their conversation couldn't help but nod their heads in satisfaction. That idea was pretty good. The man complaining shut up. His plan didn't work. It only backfired. Soon, he was jostled out of the line and the first customer finally talked with the Lamia attendant. I would like to purchase an automobile, please. The Lamia nodded. Certainly. Yes. I'm part of the lucky 100 for today. It was at that moment when all the Rebornian attendants addressed the growing crowd in front of their building. Don't worry, ladies and gentlemen. We are authorized to sell 1,000 units for today. And if you weren't so lucky, then you can try again tomorrow. And tomorrow after that, and so on and so forth. Gasps and cheers rang out from the crowd. This was music to their ears. And in comparison, this announcement sounded like screeching metal for the TriStar company. How is this possible? How can they sell even more automobiles? Interestingly enough, they wouldn't find out that answer until a few hours later. The last thing they checked was the previously destroyed automobile factory. Never in a million years would they think that another building would be constructed there just a day later. Chapter 1061, What's the Mobius Factory? Chapter 1061, What's the Mobius Factory? Suffice it to say, Reborn's sudden announcement created another wildfire of discussions amongst both upper echelons and lower echelons alike. The recreation of the automobile factory was very fast. Too fast, some might say. But it was not surprising. If one were following Reborn closely, they would know that their material called concrete allowed them to build structures at near-fantastical speed and haste. But they would have thought that the Reborn company would take at least a month to recuperate their losses, even with concrete. After all, there was the matter of psychological trauma. With the prospect of having upper echelon enemies coming from all sides, anyone would feel paranoid about creating another structure without properly setting up a new form of defense. They would have thought that the Reborn company would first seek out an ally amongst the upper echelon, one that would help them deter against the assaults of the TriStar company. But they didn't do that. They prioritized the production of the automobile company and created another one of their miraculously efficient factories. No one could blame them. The TriStar company's tirade was starting to affect public perception about automobiles. In order to stop that negative momentum, Reborn chose to risk it all by doing the same thing they did before. In most people's eyes, this was not a very wise decision. It was very hasty. I heard they rejected the Vanderbilts' offer of an alliance. That could have been their saving grace. What were they thinking? It can't be helped. I was like that once when I was young, thinking that I could do everything myself. That's too bad. Looks like TriStar is going to eventually chip at Reborn before they eventually fall. Then, the vultures waiting in the wind will have a full meal. Automobiles are just that good. But, did they have to really build their factory in the same place as before? The least they could have done was hide it somewhere desolate. Are they asking to be attacked by TriStar again? And sure enough, TriStar planned another attack. Having 1,000 units of automobiles pumping through the streets of New Sparta every single day was simply too destructive to their business. In fact, the almost billion-dollar investment they made on their anti-automobile campaign was almost undone with that one single announcement from Reborn. This couldn't stand. As the day passed and the night came, another group of shady individuals creeped through the shadows of darkness. And this time, the TriStar company didn't want to hold back. They wanted to get revenge for the destruction of their main farm. There were hundreds of them in total. Most of them were in the 4th stage. And the few strongest were in the 8th stage and one in the 9th stage. Their chests barely had a heartbeat. They were artifice magnetics. Bang! 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 Giant fireballs the size of boulders fell from the skies and crashed into the outer walls of the Mobius factory, creating a fiery explosion that sent chunks of meteorites shooting everywhere. A few automobiles at the outer car park outside the factory were destroyed, turning into crushed metal. Reborn! Come out and face us! Shouted one of the hooded figures. His heart was the coldest. A 9th stage artifice magnetic. But in response, nothing. The twisted, circular building was lightless and lifeless. It truly seemed as if the Reborn company had left no one in charge to defend the Mobius factory during this time of the night. And even a few minutes later, where the explosion would have definitely woken up everyone in a few kilometer radius, no one came. Interestingly enough, the only ones who were here, observing the attack, were the other companies. The spies and information networks of the conglomerates and the upper echelons were hard at work, watching this assault on the Mobius factory from afar. They wanted to see what Reborn would do, which apparently was nothing. Was Reborn really that irresponsible? Leaving another one of their structures undefended? The disguised artifice magnetics got impatient and walked through the destruction of the factory's outer walls, before finally coming face to face with the roll-up entrance. The 9th stage artifice magnetic kicked the side door open, which slid off very easily as if it wasn't locked in the first place. Then they all entered the factory, causing some discussions amongst the spies. There they go. Another destroyed factory. I have half a mind to join them. Why do they get to reap all the rewards? I really thought Reborn would defend themselves, but they left it alone to the wolves. Meanwhile, one of the Vanderbilt spies, Joseph's loyal right-hand man, suddenly noticed something in the wreckage. Wait, look at that part of the wall, he said, pointing at the landing site of the meteor. His allies narrowed their gazes for a few seconds, before they finally spotted it. Their eyes widened. How is that possible? The outer wall of the Mobius factory was destroyed, as expected. But one of the meteors should have also been close enough to break through one of the factory's side wide open. But it didn't. it remained unscathed, even though they were supposed to be made from the same material as the disintegrated walls outside. Unless, the Vanderbilt spies inched closer to the factory, before they were eventually able to inspect the twisting structure of the Mobius itself. This is. The other spies were curious as to why the Vanderbilts sniffed around that side of the factory and decided to inspect it themselves. And they too discovered this jaw-dropping fact. The entire factory was made out of ability power. This was a living structure, something that only the conglomerates were able to create. How did the Reborn company achieve this? And at the same moment the spies discovered this secret, the artifice magnetics inside the factory were also being awoken to another horrifying truth. They weren't alone. Chapter 1062 Living Structure. Chapter 1062 Living Structure. The sounds of panicked shouts echoed out of the Mobius factory, surprising the spies trying to understand how the Reborn company created a living structure. Bright, prismatic lights leaked out of the windows. Then silence. The spies outside were completely befuddled. 1 second, the entire Mobius factory was being besieged by hundreds of marauders. Then the next, it was as if the building returned to the lifeless state it was in before. It wasn't until a few spies decided to finally enter the compound did they find out the truth. Everyone was dead. The TriStar magnetics who had stormed the factory were now lying scattered on the ground, amidst mechanical machinery and conveyor belts, with burning holes all over their bodies. Not only that, but they died with their eyes rolled to the back of their heads, as if they experienced a tremendous brain shock before they met their demise. This shocked the spies to their core. What happened here? How did they die so easily? They wanted to examine the scene of deaths much more closely, but the sudden announcement overhead made their blood run cold. Please leave the premises as soon as possible. Trespassers will not be tolerated. Then, prismatic lights lit up the edges of the ceiling like starry lights. The spies didn't know what they were, but they knew a dangerous weapon when they saw one. It didn't take them long to realize that this was probably the reason why there were hundreds of dead bodies lying around them in a matter of a few moments. But that was not all. These spies were creatures of the dark. They knew the signs of a non-presence all around them. They couldn't feel anyone else in the building, except for their fellow spies. But through context clues and intuition, they knew that they weren't alone. They were being observed. And the fact that they couldn't sense them at all meant that they were a much more advanced user of stealth techniques than they were. Even the Vanderbilt spies found themselves struggling to find any clues about the creatures in the shadows. If they truly wanted to find out, they could easily force them out. But they knew that if they did, they'd be entering into a life or death fight that they weren't confident of leaving alive. So they left, heeding that robotic warning that shouted from the ceiling. But even if they couldn't find out the whole truth, they did understand one thing. Everyone was still underestimating the Reborn company. At the very least, they had a group of espionage magnetics under their employ whose quality of strength wouldn't be that lacking against the upper echelons. Not only that, but they seemed to also have a few talented non-combat magnetics in their midst. This new Mobius factory was a living structure. They were sure of it. This was a building that was made entirely out of ability power, one born from incredible skill, coordination, and talent. Non-combat magnetics were far and few in between, much more those who had talents in construction. And in order to create a living structure, one would need hundreds of them collaborating in tandem with each other using perfect synchronicity and vision. They needed to have their minds and hearts focused on one single project in order to birth a living structure. If even one of them had different thoughts, if even one of them had a bad dream during construction or ate a bad meal in between, then it could lead to a failed construction. It would crumble like sand bashed by placid waters. Even among the upper echelon, one could count with 2 hands those who had living structures in their base. Conglomerates themselves only had their main bases and castles made from them. But even then, even if a company only had one living structure, they would still have a massive advantage over those who didn't. After all, a living structure was as the name described. It was living. It could grow and become stronger as time passed. Some of the most famous living structures had even become as big as a mountain itself. The fact that the Reborn company had one meant that their future was very bright. And they must have known that. And now they were rubbing it in everyone's faces. Why else would they construct their new factory in the same place where it was destroyed, if not to spite the ones who destroyed it? It was like they were saying, "You want to destroy it? Try. Try." The TriStar did. And the result was their complete and utter destruction. They couldn't even make a single dent in the main factory. The only destruction they did was on the outer walls, and with concrete that could be repaired in less than half a day. Soon, the news about the failed raid on the new Mobius factory hit the ears of everyone in New Sparta. And as expected, there were a lot of doubts and disbelief. Killing the hundreds of TriStar magnetics could be explained by some hidden nascent spirit master that the Reborn company hired. Though, Their spies were adamant that no nascent spirit remnant was left in the scene. But the living structure, that was a hard pill to swallow. How could they do something that even the conglomerates struggled to do? And in the next day, the Reborn company did something that completely shocked every single one of those doubters. They announced that they were going to install gas stations around New Sparta. Up until now, everyone had been only using the fuel in their automobile's tank. And after constant use, it was now running low. So, their announcement was actually sorely needed. But then, they deployed their workers. A few hundred meters outside the New Sparta walls, Reborn started to construct their gas station. And it was led by a demi-human, a yellow monkey. Not only that, but behind him were hundreds more demi-humans just waiting for their project to start. Hello everyone, this is Shadow. Due to copyright restrictions on YouTube, I can't publish many of the audiobooks you love. That's why I've created a special paid service where you can enjoy over 300 high-quality audiobooks from platforms like Webnovel, Pocket FM, Audible, Wuxia, and more. Each novel comes as a one-time purchase, no subscriptions, no hidden fees. After payment, you'll receive full access via Telegram, along with all future updates for that novel. You'll find a wide selection of your favorite genres and titles, always in premium audio quality. Check the full list of available novels in the description. DM me now to get your favorite stories in audiobook form and start listening today.